This is the story of Hansel and Gretel. Hansel and Gretel lived in a small cottage in the forest with their father, the woodcutter. The woodcutter's second wife was a mean, nasty woman, and she demanded that they leave. Over and over again, she really felt that they did not have enough food to feed all of them in the house. She was convinced that if they took them into the forest, that surely someone would find them and take care of them. Eventually, the woodcutter agreed, and one day he took Hansel and Gretel into the forest. But Hansel had overheard of his plan, and he had been preparing. He had been collecting many stones to take with him on the journey. So the next day, when the woodcutter took them to the forest, he left behind a trail of stones so that they could find their way home again. The woodcutter left them all alone in the forest, and Hansel and Gretel were worried. Hansel told her sister not to worry because they would be able to follow the stones home. And so they did. By the light of the moon that very evening, they followed their stones all the way till they arrived home again at their cottage. And there, much to the surprise of the stepmother and the woodcutter, they were disappointed. So the woodcutter agreed, because the stepmother was outraged, to take them back into the forest. So this time Hansel consoled his sister by telling her that he would indeed have a plan. So this time, as they ventured off into the forest, Hansel and Gretel, following their father, leaving the stepmother behind, left behind a trail of breadcrumbs. This time, the woodcutter took them farther, and the two children grew more and more concerned. What they didn't realize had happened, though, was that, unlike the stones, the breadcrumbs were not a good choice. Soon the woodcutter made an excuse and left them behind, just as before. That night, Gretel grew very, very worried, and they spent the night under a large tree, huddling each other for warmth. Hansel eventually told Gretel, "Have no fear, we can follow my trail." But, much to their dismay, when they went back to find the breadcrumbs had disappeared because they had been eaten by the birds. Exhausted and hungry, Hansel and Gretel began to wander through the forest in search of their father and their home. And, much to their surprise, they came across a small cottage made of candy. Hungry and exhausted, they stopped and they ate lots and lots of candy straight from the house. They were eating and eating, very, very happy, and then somebody came out of the house. It was an old woman. And even though this old woman seemed friendly, she was disguised as a witch. As soon as she invited them in the house, she showed her true colors, and she told them of her plan to eat them. She put Gretel into a cage where Gretel stayed while she began to come up with her plan. But they weren't quite plump enough yet, so she gave them a few days. As they were waiting, Hansel, always trying to save them, was storming up a plan. But soon she put him in the cage as well. They were both in the cage, very worried, as the witch got ready for them to become her next meal. One day she'd waited long enough, they were still thin, they didn't have any skin on their bones, and she decided it is time to put you in the oven. So she warmed up the oven, but she couldn't tell if it was hot enough. They were out of their cage, as you would need to be cooked in the oven. And she asked Gretel to go check the temperature on the stove. Gretel, being the sly girl that she is, decided this was the perfect opportunity and pushed the witch into the oven. Once in the oven, just to make sure she had really done away with her, she put a padlock on the oven. For days, Hansel and Gretel stayed at that very cottage, eating candy as much as they could, while the witch stayed locked in the oven. Days passed, and eventually they thought, well, surely by now that witch is nothing but cinders. I think we can go home now. It's just then that they came across a huge chocolate egg. And in this egg, being the most unusual egg that it was, after hours of eating, they found inside the egg were hundreds and hundreds of golden coins. Full and happy that they had found their way out of their troublesome situation, in that very moment, the woodcutter, their father, showed up. Crying, he told them of the terrible news that the stepmother had died. He promised the children that he would never abandon them again and invited them home. Everybody hugged. They were all so happy, and in that moment they shared with their father about the golden coins. And they said, "Father, you will never, ever, ever have to cut wood again, because we are now rich." And they lived happily ever after. The end.